Now, that illustrates something. The US thinks of itself as the center of the world, and it has always been, since the end of the Cold War, the locomotive that pulled the global economy. The locomotive that is pulling the global economy today is not the US, it's China. And not just by a little bit, but by a very wide margin. China is by far the largest player on global commodity markets. When real estate investment in China slows down, as it did from the beginning of 2010 onward, iron ore prices go down, copper prices go down, zinc prices go down. The US is not a big player anymore on global commodity markets except oil. Now, this is important to realize, because even though the Chinese have never actually said so, in no speech to my knowledge, which points to the US as the example that China would like to follow. Yet, with the exception of its political system, China was always, for the last 35 years, since the beginning of the market reforms, the unspoken model that China aspired to follow. Especially the wealth, of course, the lifestyle, the innovation, the freedom of the people. These were all extremely attractive to the Chinese. That, I think, has become a little different in recent years as a result of the global financial crisis. The big recession that started in the US and was largely brewed in the US started in 2007. The very fact that the US stumbled so massively because of mismanagement of its own financial system and the lack of adequate corporate governance amongst its large banks and large corporations is a factor that has made a major impact on Chinese leadership. Maybe not the common people in the street, but the educated people are all worried now about the US. Can the US take care of itself? Is it worth following the US example? Now, that, I think, is important to realize. The star of the US, which was taken for granted up till about 2007, has come way down in China. That also means China now no longer has a model to follow, because there is no other country that is sufficiently big for China to really have a special interest in. They don't really like Japan, they don't really like India. They're very interested in Europe, but Europe is gradually becoming smaller and smaller relative to China. Besides, there are no really large European countries. So China is on its own for the first time since the beginning of the Deng Xiaoping reforms. And that's a new situation politically and economically. And nobody knows what the consequences of that may be. The only hope is, I think, that the US will somehow show a comeback and that China will show renewed respect for interest in the US. Otherwise, things will go downhill, in my opinion. I think there's very little reason to be optimistic. There's tremendous distrust between the United States and China on military issues. There are trade disputes all the time. There are investment disputes. The US is still unhappy about China's exchange rate policy for the wrong reasons, in my opinion, but that's it. So what are the positive elements in this otherwise somewhat gloomy scenario? One, the US has proposed and China has agreed to start negotiating a bilateral BIT, a bilateral investment treaty. The negotiations haven't started yet, but that is an important thing because of all the problems that have arisen in recent years. You've all heard about the Huawei case, but there are many such cases. The Sino is another one. China is very unhappy about the lack of warmth, lack of receptivity to investment proposals from China, except very small, innocuous investments. So the fact that the two sides have agreed to start negotiating a BIT is very important. It would be even more important if the two were to consider, 1 minute, a bilateral free trade agreement. But that's not on the agenda. The best we can hope for is a TPP, but then the TPP may have to be redesigned to make it more attractive for China, because from China's perspective, the TPP is designed to exclude China. which means, in my opinion, that if we succeed in negotiating a TPP, it's not going to be a terribly meaningful agreement, as you also agreed. So let me leave it at that. There are many other subjects that I wanted to touch on, but I've run out of time. I propose for discussion TPP. Should it be redesigned?
And actually, you have given an extremely insightful and useful discussion about the current status of Chinese-American relations and also the underlying issues from your perspective as an economist. And so we have a political scientist who is at the same time a lawyer and a leading economist, and I am a historian. And what I'm going to discuss is to try to make sense of the current, again, let me say, I'm not talking about the West and China. First, I don't know what the damn West mean. What is the West? And let me be more specific. It's about China and the United States, the current status of Chinese-American relations, and try to put this into the larger historical perspective. And if possible, if I still have some time, and if I'm self-disciplinary not enough, and then I will also discuss the deLisle Island dispute following this morning. And let me first try to emphasize that the Chinese-American relations is not in crisis. And we are not repeating the Cold War era. And all the problems between China and the United States are the problems that the United States has had with its Western allies. You name it. It's different from the Cold War era, when the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc tried to present a fundamental alternative to liberal capitalism and a market economy as the preferred path toward modernity. China does not do that. China is not willing to do that in terms of Chinese capacity and Chinese will. It's not this. China is a part of the system. Despite of all the problems, China still remains an insider of the existing international system. That's my first argument. And then, about the challenges facing the United States. And they are all real. And the most important of the challenges that are facing the United States is indeed not just the American financial system, fiscal system. For me, there are two that are mostly outstanding. One is actually the 21st century crisis of global capitalism. But this is not a challenge that the United States can alone answer. Actually, China will be part of trying to answer that challenge. And the second thing, actually this is extremely worrisome, is the ideological polarization of American politics. We Americans simply cannot find a workable solution to common sense-based challenges. That's a very, very big problem. However, having said that, I must emphasize that the United States of America, from a historical perspective, is the only most sizable democracy in the world. The constitutional foundation and the narrative of the United States remain sound. And Americans' resources are plentiful. If not for anything else, then think about oil resources. Also, the United States actually is the most ready and the most accomplished country in all big powers in meeting ecological challenges. And despite all the kind of problems that we Americans are facing, I will say I do not see an alternative to United States global leadership role. The United States is still in the middle of enjoying, as well as the rest of the world, a very long American century. That's my second argument. And there are many conditions and qualifications that I will have to make, but I'm not going to make them here because, some of which are so self-evident. I'm not talking about the United States is not, in absolute comparative terms, a declining power, but there's still no alternative. Third, my point about China. What I'm not going to argue is that China's rise is not real. What I'm not going to say is that China does not have all kinds of achievements. There are most of them. Even in the area, people think that China has not made progress in the past 3 decades. Politics. The China today, in terms of its political institution, political system, participation, every aspect, it is such a dramatically different country than the Maoist era. It's so obvious. However, China is facing phenomenal challenges that at the stage we are yet to see the Chinese will be given the right answer. Let me just emphasize two. One, let me talk about the politics. It's not that the Chinese leadership or the Chinese intellectuals or the Chinese people who are not talking about political reforms. The questions basically are two. One, are the political reforms designed in the final analysis for power checking and balancing? Does people recognize the very basic common sense based fact that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely? Do we agree with that? It's not a Western democratic style or whatever Western model. That is human experience. It's based on the fundamental weakness of human nature. Okay, the question is, what is the roadmap? How can China pursue the political reforms? On the one hand, maintain the effectiveness and efficiency functioning of the government and the basic order. We all agree that these are important things to do. At the same time, still pursue democratization. That's one question, one challenge that China is facing. But even more fundamental, I will say, this is following this morning's discussion about soft power, moral crisis. There's nothing more serious facing the Chinese than the collapse of moral bottom line of the society, which is the result of the legacy of Mao's revolutionary era, which completely destroyed China's old value system. And that situation was first further worsened with the rampant prevailing of materialism during the reform and opening era. And that was even further enhanced by something that the human race had never witnessed, the result of one-child policy, which is producing a whole generation or several generations of completely different animals that we human race have witnessed. So, how China will answer these challenges? Will China continue to rise? I hope so. But if China continuously is to rise, China is not going to replace the United States to claim a Chinese century in the 21st century. And then it will be a very complex, paradoxical, prolonged process. So my third point is China's prolonged process. Finally, using my last 2 minutes, I still have some time. Let me talk about the deLisle dispute. Let me be very, very, unfortunately, Kato is not here. Let me say, Japan is wrong. China is not necessarily right, but there are more reasons to give the Chinese stand serious consideration. Why? History in this case is not the past. History in this case is about legitimacy. History in this case is not just about memory. History in this case is about legitimacy narrative, the essence of the People's Republic of China. Sing the national anthem. What is the statement? The Chinese nation has reached the most dangerous moment. Who are the enemies? 冒着敌人的炮火前进. Who are they? You really don't need to repeat anything else. And in this particular case, deLisle incident is so much related to why do the Chinese try to link it to, say, Yakasuni Shrine. And do we understand that from a historical perspective, it's not a legal or lawful perspective, but completely from a legitimacy perspective, what is the meaning of 1895 for China, the year that Diaoyu or Senkaku was officially incorporated into Ryukyu? And what does it mean for China, the meaning of 1945? You talk about Cairo Declaration of 1943 and then Potsdam Proclamation. What does it mean about Treaty of San Francisco? Think about all of these things. And also the normalization of Chinese-Japanese relations is based upon one condition, that China actually gave up all war preparation requirement for Japan. Today in China, nothing is more powerful a legitimacy statement than what Chairman Mao made at the time of the PRC formation. We, the Chinese people, have stood up. In no circumstance should anyone in any part of the world, least of all Japan, to remind the Chinese that they have not stood up. That is more profound than the superficial, so-called angry youth nationalist sentiment. As a historian, I have a greater sympathy toward the kind of legitimacy concern. And it's our responsibility, all of us, to try to help China go out of that victim mentality, to help China and help the whole world to live in a more peaceful, prolonged peaceful environment. Thank you. Okay, I think I should open the floor to the audience, right? We don't have much direct, debate between us. Yes, Professor Hussain.
Right.
It's so good to see you here.
Right.
It's good for you to see me here too, right?
Yeah. Well, I just want to draw attention to that. If you take the United States and China as two global powers, the relationship between global powers, the two powers is very strange. Because given the United States' fiscal position, United States is heavily dependent on China to finance its deficit.
Yes.
And the way US politics is working, that problem is not likely to be solved. It might actually be worsened.
Yes.
So in some sense, when we talk about rivalry, we should also take into account this economic independence that is, I think, going to complicate relationships. So when people talk about global power, if you take it in historical sense, I don't think there have been ever global powers which are so dependent on each other. And finally, I just want to draw attention to democracy. That is, it's a basic thesis that countries don't become democratic just because they get converted to democratic ideas. They reach a stage where they think that there is no other form of governance possible except a democratic one. So if there is progress in democracy in China, it would take that form. That is, Chinese leadership will reach a position where it thinks that the only way to keep on governing China and gain legitimacy is to adopt certain democratic reform. It may not lead to complete democracy, but it may constitute some very important steps.
I cannot agree more. Actually, this is exactly what I say. What is most important is not just to say we want to see a democratic China, but a roadmap we can try to design for it. Yeah, you have anything to comment on Professor Hussain's?
And I think, that's an important and true point. It is rare to see this kind of economic interdependence, and it does provide strongly self-interested reasons for not upsetting the apple cart. And this may be a political scientist economist sort of, or maybe a lawyer economist difference. People do irrational and stupid things sometimes, and in the U.S. there is this near paranoia about the significance of Chinese-owned U.S. debt and what that means. Now, one gets in those debates in the U.S., and the answer always is the old joke. If you owe your banker a little money, you have a problem. If you owe your banker a lot of money, he has a problem. So there are not too many other options. But I think it is when cooler heads prevail, which is most of the time, one of the foundations for what has been a stable relationship.